Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Smarter Podcasting. Now, I need to be really, really honest with you. Even the best of us, and I'm not the best, can make mistakes. In this episode, I was almost 100% sure that my Shure microphone was connected into my pod track. Looks like it's connected right now. And we finished the episode. I went back and listened to it. It's an amazing episode with Guang Jin. I was so excited to share it to you. And as soon as I pressed play, I could hear that the microphone sounded awful. And I'm pretty sure I wasn't connected to my Zoom P4 pod track and Shure microphone. Hundreds and hundreds of dollars worth of equipment. I think I was attached to my Bluetooth headphones or even the microphone on my computer, and the sound is not great. So I just want to say we all make mistakes. The sound is maybe not as well. It's not maybe. The sound is god awful on this, and I'm so sorry for that because I'm a professional and it should be better than that. And I apologize again profusely. Please forgive me. But I hope you enjoy this episode anyway, because there's so much valuable information in it. I honestly cannot stress that enough. So enjoy the episode. Please let me know what you think. And apologies again for the awful sound. I'm so sorry. All right, enjoy. The data that YouTube can give you just pales in comparison to what we get from podcast hosts. Like, the video really is the future.
At the end of the day, we do see that the numbers itself is so incredibly high that I completely understand why moving into video now is beneficial.
Welcome to another episode of Smarter Podcasting with me, your host, Niall Mackay, the podcast guy. I started my first podcast in 2019. I've been listening to podcasts since they first came about when I had an iPod, if you even know what that is. And I'm absolutely obsessed with podcasts. I live and breathe them. I started my first podcast as a hobby, and then I learned so much that I ended up starting my own business called 7 Million Bytes Podcast. And we now work with podcasters all around the world to help them make the best podcast possible. We've produced over 50 podcasts. We've helped with over 700 episodes. We've helped with millions of downloads, and podcasts get to the top of the Apple Podcast charts as well. So thank you so much for tuning into this episode. Remember, you can follow, subscribe, turn on notifications, hit that bell, do all of that stuff so that you never miss an episode. And most of all, please share this with other podcasters so we can help as many people make the best podcast possible. And if you want to work with us, then get in touch. The notes will have the link so you can contact me, and we would love to talk to you about how we can help your podcast. Now, in today's episode, I am really, really excited because we're going to be talking about how expanding from an audio-only focus to YouTube completely changed the game for one podcaster, and why you should do this and how to do it. So my guest today, he started off his career with Procter & Gamble, and he was developing deep expertise in digital and traditional media. He is also the founder of a podcast production house based near me, based in Singapore, called One Up Media. You may have heard of them. And you can think of them as the Wondery of Southeast Asia. And they were the first Asian production house to make it to the Ambies 2024, competing alongside the massive giants like Sony Music and Warner Brothers Entertainment. And probably the most important thing about my guest today is that he also loves craft beer, just like me too. My guest today is Guang Jin. Guang, thank you so much for coming on Smarter Podcasting to share some amazing insights today.
Awesome, sick man. Thanks for having me here. And also, what a killer introduction. I totally forgotten that I was in Procter & Gamble, so thanks for reminding me.
You can thank your LinkedIn profile for that information as well, but thank you very much. And if you do watch this podcast or you follow this podcast regularly, I love that feedback because I actually follow introduction template for every guest, and I share this on the podcast, especially when I do audits as well. And so if you want to know what I just did and why you thought that was so good, because that feedback is the same feedback I get every time I do that introduction. I learned it from a YouTube video which shared how all the late night hosts like Jimmy Kimmel, Jimmy Fallon, Jay Leno, all the way back to them, how they all do their introductions for their guests. And they all follow the same structure. They give 3 things about their guests before they say their name. So the best example was, I think it was Jimmy Fallon, was like, my guest today has just done a sold out tour of America. He's the #1 show on Netflix, and he's the most famous comedian in the world. My guest today is, and then he walks out the curtain, Dave Chappelle. And so it builds up that excitement for the guest as well and for the audience because they don't really know who it's going to be. So that was the structure that I just did there that I do on every episode. And the feedback that you gave there is normally feedback that I get, which makes me feel amazing that you enjoyed that introduction. So thank you very much for coming on.
Awesome. No, as in, it's definitely such a sick introduction. But also, I mean, I can see the show eventually becoming like a late night show. So I can't wait for them to call you in to host.
As long as I'm better than James Corden, that's the main thing. So tell me how you got from Procter and Gamble to running One Up Media in Singapore.
Right, right. I think my story is quite similar to yours in the sense that podcasting has always been a thing that's fun. And I've always been a listener. I think after a while, right, when you consume something for so long, a part of you would start to think maybe I can do, like, maybe I can create. And I think that opportunity only came during COVID, where naturally there's a lot more time, a lot more digital flexibility. I was like, okay, with so much time, why not just try this thing, right? That's when we started a podcast on career, actually. And it was a guest show podcast. We'll ask people how did they make one foot into the company of their dreams. And then we kind of call it One Foot In. It's a super cheesy podcast. We moved all the episodes for the sake of the future of my company. But like, that's kind of what we were doing before. In the middle of that, I think what happened is we kind of gained the skills like you to kind of create some stuff. And I think over time we realized, okay, like we're able to do this well. Can we kind of try a different like genre? And I think at that point in time, the biggest genre was true crime. Everyone knows that true crime is just bowling in the West. And Singapore is also predominantly English speaking. So it's just very natural for me to kind of go like, maybe true crime might be an interesting thing to do. We were kind of lucky. We met our local TV networks through a audio competition. And via there, we actually started building up this true crime podcast with them. One thing led to another, and it just became this massive podcast that they're using right now. That actually it's kind of wild. Like how we've scaled up from there. We're like producing for them over, I think, close to 200 episodes by now. And also for a podcast on romance. So that's kind of our TLDR.
Amazing. Oh, and I love it. And similar to me as well, mine was a COVID story as well. I lost my job during COVID and slowly kind of transitioned into making podcasts as well, which I think is a similar story for probably a lot of people. But what I want to talk about today is something that I actually hate to admit. And I know there's a lot of controversy in the industry. Maybe you can call it controversy. I've been reading a lot recently. There's a couple of emails I got from a guy called Matt on audio, and he mentioned things like from James Cridlin from Pod News that you know as well, and you've mentioned in your posts. And that is becoming more of a video platform. So podcasting going from audio only to video. And the reason why I say I hate myself for this is in this article I just read by Matt, he talked about James Cridlin saying how it should be audio only. And I used to be an audio only dinosaur. I was like, no, it's only a podcast if you have an RSS feed and it's available on Spotify and it's available on Apple Podcasts and video is YouTube. And that means you're a vlogger, blah, 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 blah. And I ended up realizing I was banging my head against a brick wall and you have to just kind of go with the times. And so I still believe a little bit that you can't have a YouTube only channel and call it a podcast, but people do. But it really should be available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, etc., and YouTube to be able to call yourself a podcast. But what Matt was saying in his article that I just read this morning, and he had another one yesterday, I think, as well, which was really interesting, is that it doesn't really matter what we think, it's how the medium is consumed and the way the younger generation and even my generation as well are consuming media these days. They are still consuming audio only content, and we can't deny that. And that is still booming and growing, and audio only content isn't going anywhere. But there is a whole generation of people that see anything with a microphone as a podcast. And it doesn't matter if they see it on TikTok or if they see it on YouTube. They just see somebody talking into a microphone and that is a podcast. They don't care about RSS feeds. They don't care if it's available on Apple Podcasts. They might only consume it on TikTok. And so I am fully in the camp that we have to embrace that now. And I've done that in the last year myself, in the last 6 to 7 months. So we've We're doing smarter podcasting now on video and YouTube. We're doing a Vietnam podcast, which is my main podcast I started in 2019. We're doing more YouTube now, using the short form clips, things like this. So I'm on board with it now. But what I wanted to talk to you about was something that you posted just this well. You posted your first post 3 weeks ago, and then you just posted another update yesterday. And as soon as I saw your update, I messaged you and I was like, hey, do you want to come on Smarter Podcasting? I want to talk about this. So let me just quickly go through what you posted 3 weeks ago, first of all. And I'll kind of skip through some of it. But you said, hey, audio producers, let me ask you something. What if your podcast could grow 2.5 times faster by tapping into YouTube's massive audience? We've been experimenting with a service that takes MP3s and turns them into MP4s, complete with cool animations and visuals sourced from real life images. And guess what? It's working way better than we imagined. Here's what we've seen. Our true crime channel on YouTube, we launched just 10 months ago, now matches the monthly viewership of a podcast we've been running for 2 to 3 years. That's a 2.5 times huge leap. But it gets even better. YouTube isn't just growing on its own, it's feeding our podcast growth too. Our subscriber count has been climbing right alongside the YouTube numbers. Basically, we built a growth loop, audio to video, video back to audio. Now we want to try this with a few others on narrative podcasts just to see if we can make that magic work. And then a nice little link to James Cridlin and Pod News. So that was 3 weeks ago. And then what I saw yesterday was about a month ago, I shared here on LinkedIn how expanding from an audio only focus to YouTube completely changed the game for us. We managed to match our YouTube viewership to our existing audio audience, creating a virtuous loop audio driving video and video sending people back to audio. Well, the past 28 days have taken things to a whole new level. 245,000 views, an extra 3.7 thousand subscribers. And as of now, we've crossed the 10,000 subscribers milestone on YouTube. And to think we only started taking this seriously 6 months ago. It's wild to see how this is rewriting our assumptions. We used to believe an audio show was for an audio audience, but it's clearly more nuanced. The crossover potential is bigger than we imagined, and it's been amazing to watch it unfold. Wow, that is beyond anyone's wildest dreams, I imagine. So tell me, I've seen the platform that you created that, as I mentioned there, takes the audio file from an MP3 and then creates an animated video. And I watched it and I was blown away. So tell me, first of all, about that software, about that program, and then tell me about the results that I've just talked about and what you've seen.
Okay. I think it's worth clarifying that straight up, it's not like a exact software whereby somebody uploads an MP3 and then after that downloads an MP4. Essentially, what's happening is that we are more of a little bit like a advertising production house, and how we have a lot of human parts to creating this as well. So rather than just a direct software which is able to create it, this has a lot of human interventions. So why is it that we're doing this, right? It's because for a couple of reasons. I think one is if you were like me, right, and you went through this existential crisis as an audio producer, and you kind of like started to find for solutions, you will turn for as many of the softwares that you can find online, and you will realize that none of them can achieve that long form production that you're looking for. You realize that most of them can only do short form if it's, for example, like advertising. If you want to create a very, very short 30-second stock footage advert. Or it could be something where you want to create like a very, very simple pitch to someone who wants to buy into your show and create like a 3-minute pitch. Now, when things become like 15 minutes and longer, it starts to get way more complex for any software out there to really successfully do it. So what we found is that it needs massive human intervention. And when I say that, right, it means literally we have people who touch up any generative image and video. And we have people that actually also hand animate some of the images that we have as well. So as a result of that, right, we've kind of reached this sweet spot where we are able to produce a quality that is good enough on YouTube and video platforms to be viewed better than cheap television by viewers. And at the same time, it's not as weird and minimalist as an audiogram. You know what I mean? So that's kind of what's happening behind the scenes for us to eventually create everything. And it also ensures that every single thing is pretty much custom built to each person who or each client that wants to work with us. And I think the result is quite sick. We're actually scaling it up internally for ourselves because I realized like, whoa, it's like quite a powerful platform for true crime. So now we're gonna try it for romance and business history as well.
Amazing. That is incredible. And so this is what I love as well, because the audiograms just don't work. And you may have been told this, and I've read blogs that do this, get audiograms. And I've done it, and it gets almost the zero traction. It's not worth the time at all. Just having some moving words on a picture with an audio form or a wave form. So that's incredible. What I really want to know, what I'm interested in, is what is the engagement rate of these videos? Because one thing I talk about a lot is audio only. The stats say that 80% of people who will start an audio only podcast will finish it, which is incredible. And you're generally looking at about a 60 to 80% consumption rate of an audio only podcast, which makes sense to me. I mean, I generally never put on a podcast and don't finish it because I know the ones I love and the ones I like. I'm going to put it on, I'm going to listen to it right to the very end. YouTube is a completely different beast. There's suggested videos on the side, there's cards come up at the top. You're on your browser or you're on your phone, you're looking at it, you're going to get a message, you're going to skip out the video. There's some videos that I watch that I literally just skip through to find the information I want, or it's an entertaining video, but I don't want to watch all of it. There was one I was watching yesterday and I like skipped through half of it. So generally on YouTube, you're looking at, on a good day, like 30 to 40%, I think is what I understand. I just checked a video that I just posted, which I'm going to share a little bit more information about that in a second. But I just double checked. So I just did an episode as well that you can go back and check. I recently just fully integrated my podcast with YouTube, which I hadn't done before. So now the audio files get put onto YouTube automatically. And the reason I didn't do that in the beginning was because I knew it was going to be a static image and it was going to be rubbish. So I was just like, I'm not going to bother doing it. But then now everyone's on YouTube. I've read so much about YouTube being so popular. I was like, right, I'll just put them on there. It doesn't really matter. So now what I do on YouTube is I create, all my episodes are created, unfortunately, primarily video first, which I cannot believe I'm saying that because I'm an audio guy, but they are primarily created video first with audio in mind. And if I'm presenting it, I say things like thanks for tuning in instead of thanks for watching, which before I would say thanks for listening. Then I realized I was saying thanks for watching, which was alienating my listeners. So now I say things like thanks for tuning in, which can be applied to both mediums. So I am conscious of the audio medium as well, but primarily all my episodes are like we're doing right now, either recorded online or I record it in person. To go back to my point, I've just recorded a YouTube video on Sunday here in Vietnam. We just had Vietnam won the Asian Cup. They beat Thailand, and it was a super exciting game. And I went out to watch it, and I took my camera with me, I took my microphones with me, and I recorded an episode. And thankfully, there is a thing in Vietnam called Di Bao, which means the storm. And when they win a game, sometimes even when they lose a game, everybody takes to the streets with flags, vuvuzelas, pots and pans, motorbikes, honking, and it is one of the most joyful things you will ever see in your life. It is pure, unadulterated joy and happiness, and the city fills up until the wee hours of the morning. I heard somebody say that they were out till it was happening till 4 in the morning, banging pots and pans, singing. It's just an incredible thing, and I got to be part of it, and I recorded it. Now I posted that. I came home on Monday. Well, I came home Sunday night. Monday I edited it immediately so I could get it out quickly because I knew it was relevant. And I'm so excited to share this. I just checked as we were talking there. As we are talking, it's just past the 30,000 views mark, which, as YouTube tells me, is 30,000 more views than I normally get. So that is just a massive, massive milestone. But again, going back to my point, the engagement rate on that video is 15%, which again is way higher than any of my other videos. When I check the audio version of it, which is just a static image, which is automatically uploaded to YouTube because I put it on Spotify and Apple Podcast, I made a specific audio version of the video, which I took out all the dead air, all the times where I wasn't talking, things like this, tightened it up a bit. That got an engagement rate of 1%. So that shows the difference. I think even though it's worthwhile putting your podcast on YouTube, if it has a static image, you're going to get some traction. And like you've talked about that loop, you might be able to send some people back to your podcast. To me, getting a 1% engagement rate, the average view was 10 seconds, whereas the video, the average view was 15 minutes or something like that, 15%. So what you're doing, making these, turning these narratives, sorry, these audio podcasts, and then creating more than just an audiogram, creating a video. What is the engagement difference? How much engagement are you getting with these videos that you're creating?
Right. I think our engagement rate is somewhat similar, around like maybe 20-30%, assuming that you're measuring it based on view to complete, right? If it's view to complete, I think that's somewhat similar. But I think the interesting thing is that YouTube has so much more data that I think measures really what you mean by engagement. I think one thing is that they'll tell you the number of returning viewers that you have, right? And our returning viewers are massive and it comes very consistently. In terms of comments, for example, like our top video has about 400 comments and people are debating on the comment section itself, right? With people confessing about a particular like criminal who had reached out to a lot of boys before, and there are people talking about how he had been reached out by him before. Now, of course, we don't know how true that is, right? But what I'm saying is that in terms of the metrics, right, it's a bit hard to have a 1:1 just cause of the amount of numbers that you get of YouTube. And like once again, like don't get me wrong, like I'm an audio guy as well. Like 100% believe in audio. In fact, like our unique selling point of our company, which I always tell people, is that we have super immersive sound. And I never tell people that we have incredible graphics or something like that, because that's not who we are. But I'm kind of reforming who I am based on just the facts that's in front of me. I think the other interesting thing about engagement to understand, right, is we always focus on the percentage. But I think now the question is like, what is the number of engaged people that you have? I think YouTube, that number is massive for us. Like, it's like 25K returning viewers right now that consistently return across 28 days, which is insane, right? So perhaps the percentage wise is low, but on that absolute number, I think it's massive, right? I can't say so much about podcasts because we also don't have that data, right? And we'll base it off surveys, etc., which is not 1:1. But I think we'd like to presume that it's higher, right? But again, we're not sure. What we know from YouTube is the numbers right now. So yeah, I guess long story short, to answer your question, same engagement if you measure it by view to complete, but it's more nuanced than that.
And I love what you've just said. And this is why, just in the last few months, I've kind of converted to YouTube and become a bit of a lover of YouTube because of the depth of the data that you get. And I'm not a YouTube guy. I don't really even, I just scratch the surface. I don't have a YouTube manager yet. I would hopefully maybe eventually have one that knows what they're doing. I don't look at the data deeply. But the data that YouTube can give you just pales in comparison to what we get from podcast hosts like I use Buzzsprout and from the RSS feed. And it is really a shame that podcasting, it's something that for years, I think all podcasters have kind of wanted, but I just don't think, from my understanding, the technology just isn't there to be able to give us the same depth of detail that YouTube does. So it is a bit of a shame. And I'm sound like an old man that's like begrudgingly being dragged into the future, but I was such an audio only guy. And now I understand that there's space for both, but the video really is the future.
I agree. But also, right, like I do want to give credit to audio in the sense that we're also starting to learn a couple of things. which to us, we're not sure what to make sense of. One of it is, for example, what we did is that we took our old episodes of our narrative true crime, which, by the way, is not a guest show podcast, but it's like old episodes of our narrative true crime podcast, and then we animate them into video. Now, when we look at the listeners who are within audio versus the listeners who are video, we realize that for our audio listeners, and anyone who does true crime will know this, 90% of your listeners are women.
That's interesting because I looked at my channel and 90% are men, which I don't understand why because my channel is about Vietnam, but my YouTube is 90% men. So yeah, it's it. But this is the kind of data that you can get that is incredible. So sorry for interrupting. Continue.
Yeah, no. But I think the interesting thing is for true crime podcasters, if you've researched your audience, you will also know that generally the reason why it's 90% women is because when women hear true crime, they feel like they're learning something. They feel like they're learning how to protect themselves. It's productive use of their time because more often than not, women are the victims. But then the question is, why don't guys listen to it? Like, is it because they think it's a waste of time? Not exactly. When we talk to the very, very few guys that tried the true crime podcast, but then after that they left, they said that the reason why they don't listen to it, which is a bit morbid, is that it sounds a bit like them. So what I mean, right, is like, for example, in the description of the perpetrator, we could say things like, growing up, he was very quiet. He had no friends at school. And then some of the guys are like, shit, I'm an introvert. And I've got no friends at school at one point in my life. So a lot of them start to project it, right? It becomes a very personal thing for them. So why am I sharing this with everyone is because when you look at video, it's almost 50-50 women and men listening. So why is it that the men are more comfortable listening to video? When we talk to them, they don't get that same feeling. Like they don't like take that character and then kind of like personify who they are. Now, there could be a few reasons behind this. One is that when it comes to video, there's an image of the guy. So you don't fill up the image in your mind, which is yourself, right? So you have a reference character. And as a result of that, the experience is a bit more out of body and less empathetic, right? And the reason why I'm sharing this is because there is an argument that therefore it becomes slightly less engaging, right? To some extent, because the person is now just watching it, but not imagining themselves in that placement, right? And that's why I do want to give credit for audio. When we say that audio is more engaging, there is something that I think must exist, which is the reason why we're seeing this difference. But at the end of the day, right, we do see that the numbers itself is so incredibly high, right? That I completely understand why moving into video now is beneficial. Because these high numbers are going to bring way more new people into your audio, who's then going to also start sharing it to new people and then bring more to your video. And actually, now you create this growth engine. I think it's a worth it trade off, in my opinion.
No, amazing. So tell me then, how and why should the listener right now who wants to make the podcast better, they want more listeners, they want more numbers, how and why should they do that in your opinion?
Okay. Firstly, wow, this is a really, really complex question. I think firstly, you really got to think about what's your strategy as a podcaster, right? Like, are you creating intellectual property or are you creating kind of a personality or platform? What I mean by that is when you're creating an intellectual property, what you're trying to do with an intellectual property is to ensure that the IP can take as many forms as possible. That is the benefit of an IP, and better still if it can become a merchandise that you can sell, right? But that's very different versus like if you're just creating a platform, a show where it could be like recreational, or it could be simply you building up, I don't know, like a key opinion leader among audio people. Like if that's the case, then of course you should stick within podcasting. You should also ask yourself, like, are you going to be a production house for others, and therefore you specialize in audio? which is why you should stick to audio, right? I think these questions first is the most important because naturally, if you're going to create an IP, you need to stretch that IP as far as you can. Now, of course, the question is like, do you want to go into video because you are constrained by your clients? What that means is that your clients is paying you by CPM and you know that your impressions will go up the moment you adopt video, right? Then that's of course a different question. Like, of course, you should go ahead and do it. So it's definitely quite an existential question that you got to ask yourself, right? The other thing that I'll say is like, once you're certain that you want to go into video, the question is, of course, how. The how is very different based on whether you're a guest show or a narrative podcast. If you're a guest show, I think it's a lot simpler in terms of only needing to spend more upfront costs for the camera. And then after that, of course, the edits will come. But now when you edit a video, you naturally edit the audio alongside it. So that's kind of what happens. I think the real challenge is if you're in narrative podcasts, which is predominantly where the audio money initially lied at, right? For narrative shows, it's a massive problem. It's why we took 6 months going live on YouTube. But what we didn't share is that we took another 6 months beforehand testing it, like hiring consultants, bringing in people to try different things to eventually iron out what workflow works and what is the equivalent of video that isn't trash, right? Like how many frames per second should we have? Stuff like that. And then what is the response? So what I can say is that if you're a narrative podcast, right, the way you can go about it is to really ask yourself, like, what is the minimum amount of images that someone needs in order to think your podcast is legit? If you create an audiogram, right, people would be thinking it's a bit like, I don't know what's this. If you add 3 or 4 images, they might think like, oh, this is a very cheap production, right? If you add more and more and more, eventually you will hit that sweet spot. And I think it's fascinating because like you were reading and you were talking about reading Matt, reading James Cridland. And I mean, love those guys. They're super awesome. In fact, right, James, man, we have like so much gratitude for him. He helped us in so many ways. And in fact, we also helped him wrote the podcasting in Asia section for Pod News. It's, yeah, like I just can't say enough about how awesome that guy is. I think it's interesting that when we look at video, right, and their opinions on it, is that audio to video, if it's cheap television, it won't succeed. And I actually agree. Like, if it's really trashy, it won't succeed. But I do think like there is a group of people that feel once it's animated or once it has a video component, it's no longer cheap. And the reason is because I think cheap television has certain characteristics which a narrative podcast doesn't have. One of its characteristic, I think, is poor storyline and maybe not as immersive sound design. But a podcast has that, a narrative podcast has that. So essentially, all you need to qualify is the video component. Now, this one is going to be really, really hard. And quite transparently, like, as in, we have tried it, we've commissioned animators itself to do it. And like the cost itself to hit the level that you want is pretty intense. Yeah, it's pretty intense. Even if you hire someone off Fiverr in the cheapest country that you can find, and we've done that. Like I'm just saying the truth, right? And we have tried a couple of them. However, for us right now, we've kind of found like this sweet spot that works. And I mean, like I'm definitely happy to share with anyone who's interested, right? But of course, we do need to prioritize right now based on client list because we don't want to oversell this. I know the results are sick for us, but I want to be sure like it's going to be good as well for others. So we're probably not going to scale it up massively. 1 or 2 clients that's big ticket.
Guang Jin, this is amazing. Thank you so much for sharing this. I love all your posts on LinkedIn. I love the work that you do. Thank you for coming on Smarter Podcasting. I really, really appreciate your time. This has been so insightful. Thank you for tuning in as well. Remember, follow, subscribe, turn on notifications, do all of that good stuff. Leave a review unless it's going to be less than 5 stars, then don't bother about it. Just only 5-star reviews are allowed, please. I think we've actually put a filter that you're not allowed to leave anything less than 5 stars. No, I'm kidding on, but please don't leave anything less than 5 stars. And the best thing that you can do is share this podcast with somebody else who wants to make the best podcast possible. And if you want to work with us, then please get in touch. It's neil@7millionbikes.com, or just go to the show notes or description to find the link. Guang Jin, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for being a guest on Smarter Podcasting, and I look forward to seeing the growth of One Up Media and your YouTube success. Cheers.
Awesome. Cheers.